or so, but just want to welcome everyone to the roundtable this evening. And I see some of our attendees floating in. So we'll go ahead and get started in just another few seconds. Thanks for joining us. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and good afternoon to our friends on the West Coast. My name is Taylor Drady, and I serve as the Senior Director of Policy for the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute, CCAI, a nonprofit that was founded by the United States Congress over 20 years ago to be a resource to members of Congress and their staff on adoption and child welfare issues. I am very much looking forward to tonight's discussion on how the opioid crisis has impacted our child welfare system. Between 2000 and 2016, the frequency of parental substance abuse as a factor in child removals by U.S. child welfare authorities almost doubled from 18.5% to 35.3%. And parental substance use has become one of the second most common circumstances associated with child removal. As we all here virtually gathered to discuss how we can break down the barriers for children and families that have been impacted by this crisis, we will also discuss policy solutions to help provide resources and support. We are very excited to have Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, Washington State Senator Twena Nobles, and Nicole Mason from Amara here with us tonight. I am now honored to introduce U.S. Representative Marilyn Strickland from the 10th Congressional District in Washington State. Representative Strickland is the first African-American to represent Washington State at the federal level, and one of the first Korean-American women elected to Congress in its 230-year history. She is a very strong voice for change and is deeply committed to tonight's discussion on how the opioid crisis has impacted children and families in the U.S. foster care system. Representative Strickland most recently introduced the Furthering Opioid Services Training and Educational Resources, known as the Foster Act. This bipartisan legislation will provide training and resources for foster and kinship caregivers to support children and parents affected by this crisis. Congresswoman, I'm happy to go ahead and turn it over to you, and thank you so much for your leadership on these issues.
Great. Well, thank you, Taylor, for that introduction, and thank you to Senator Nobles, who represents me and a lot of people in our community, and just thank you to Amara and all the partners who are having this very important conversation. If you think about the fact that we have been in a pandemic for 2 years, some of the emotional stress and strain that a lot of families were having even before the pandemic and now during the pandemic, we know that there are children who actually are affected when we talk about addiction and crisis, and specifically with opioids. And I want to talk about this today because I like to provide statistics for people. The epidemic has affected countless families and communities across the entire United States. 1.6 million people in the country had an opioid use disorder in 2019, and the situation only got worse in 2020 as the US experienced its highest ever number of reported overdose deaths. Children are now entering foster care at higher rates alongside this crisis, and the rate of child removals, and I want you to listen to this, primarily attributed to parental abuse, substance abuse, has doubled from 18.5% in the year 2000 to 36% in 2018 alone. And while the data doesn't necessarily distinguish between the different types of substances, we know that experts agree that opioids, sadly, are driving this surge. The numbers in Washington State are similarly tragic. As of 2017, the latest year for which data is available, 58,000 children were affected by the opioid epidemic, including 7,500 removed from home for foster or kinship care. And my district is the center of this issue. Since 2002, overdose deaths due to opioids have more than doubled in Pierce County, and they've tripled in Mason County and other counties as well nearby. And we want to make sure that as this crisis is happening, that we are paying special attention to children. This crisis sadly has extended to foster care. Pierce, Mason, and Thurston counties are all above the state average in Washington for children entering out-of-home care. And that's why, with assistance from organizations like Amara and my co-leads, Representatives Susan Wild and Brian Fitzpatrick in the Congress, I released the Foster Act early in October. And this really provides grants to states and localities providing child protective services to do a few things. It's going to train staff and caregivers about the impact of opioid addiction on children under their care. And the grants are going to be used from everything from foster care workforce recruitment to training on the effects of this opioid abuse on children, and even helping adoptive parents understand how this crisis has affected the children that they want to adopt. And we know that even though we talk about parents having this substance abuse disorder, the risk is very, very high for children. And studies have found that children who are in these homes, sadly, are actually at more risk for severe harm than children who are in homes with parents who do not have these addictions. And this is going to leave a lasting impact on children. It's traumatic, both physically, sometimes emotionally. And we have a system, sadly, that is underburdened and over-resourced. And anyone who works in the state can tell you that. So it's really important for people who have the trust of caring for these precious children to really have resources they need. And this is one component of it. It's not going to address the entire crisis in the foster care system, but providing support for children, for families, for staff members, when we talk about this opioid crisis and understanding that these children have some very, very different issues than other kids in foster care, and just making sure that we're acutely aware of how this is affecting children. So I now want to turn the spotlight over to Senator Tawana Nobles, and she's going to talk about some very important legislation that she's introduced as a freshman in the Washington State Senate. Senator.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm Senator Tawana Nobles and really excited to be here today. And the legislation that I've worked on here in Washington State is a great companion to the work that you are doing, Representative, on the federal level, because you're correct. Our young people, their families, they need support. They need someone paying attention to their needs each day. For folks who don't know, in my background in childhood, I experienced foster care and thankfully had really amazing points of contact because I did have a family member that struggled with substance abuse. And while it was not connected to opioids, it did impact the lives of myself and my brothers. And it was really important that whether it was teachers or coaches, other adults who were surrounding us and supporting us, that they had the training, the resources, but also could pay attention to our needs. And that has really attributed to my success as an adult. And now I get to create legislation as someone that previously experienced foster care. And this year, my very first year as a state senator, I had an opportunity to work with OSPI and a number of partners and have the support of organizations like Amara to create legislation that would require a point of contact at all of our K-12 public schools. And that's elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, to make sure that there is a designated point of contact in every building. And currently our school districts have district liaisons who have previously been paying attention to the needs of our youth experiencing foster care and our youth experiencing homelessness, all of our McKinney-Vento students. And so this would really break that down and make sure that a contact has been appointed by the principal and will work with that district liaison. And this point of contact will be responsible for coordinating services and resources and knowing the names of our youth experiencing foster care in our K-12 schools. And again, it means a lot to me, especially with the statistics that you shared and knowing that still fewer than 50% of our foster youth are graduating high school and fewer than 3% are obtaining college degrees. I want to make sure that there is something that we're doing on a state level. And this is one step, one way to provide some training, some support, and just another pathway and resource for our youth experiencing foster care. And I'm also excited that this legislation rolled out pretty immediately here in our schools in Washington State. So I look forward to tracking this legislation and meeting some of the designated points of contact in our school, but working in partnership with your legislation and with Amara and all the ways that will support our youth experiencing foster care. I suspect that we'll be able to impact many of those statistics and create a more promising future for our youth experiencing care. And I will hand it over either to you, Taylor, or to Nicole.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Senator. And yes, now we'd love to hear from Nicole and Amara to share a little bit about the work that they're really doing to move the needle on the ground in Washington State.
Yeah, well, thank you. And first of all, I just want to take a moment to thank you for including us. And wow, I am here with giants. You are both, Congresswoman Strickland and Senator Noble's, just doing really phenomenal policy work. And we are so thankful for everything that you're doing. As you have both already shared, there's a lot going on related to the pandemic and foster care in general. And although in the state of Washington, we're actually seeing decreasing numbers across the state as a whole in kids coming into care, we are seeing increasing numbers in certain regions. Overall, we've seen a decrease from last year by about 10%, but what we have seen is a significant percentage of youth who are coming into care due to substance-related issues. So I got some hot off the press numbers. It's up to 43% at this point. So it's continuing to increase over time. And those numbers do vary really significantly by region within our state. And they're not broken down by the specific types of substance use, but we do know that it is going in lockstep with opioid use. So it does feel very safe to assume that these are very closely related. As Congresswoman Strickland shared, there's been a significant increase from 18.5% in the year 2000 up to this 43% in 2020. And it really does appear to be tracking with the opioid epidemic. So I want to share a little bit about what foster youth's experience is and kind of where they are when they come into care. And it's important for everyone to know that there's different places that youth can end up when they come into foster care. They can go into a foster home, and that is a licensed home. And those are typically caregivers who are unrelated and the child doesn't know them prior to coming into their care. Or they could go into a kinship home, a kinship caregiving home, and that could be a licensed or an unlicensed home, but it's typically going to be a family member, or if it's not a direct relation, then it's going to be a very close family friend or a mentor. So someone who has a relationship with that child prior to them coming into their home. Now, licensed caregivers, they do receive training, but this training really is insufficient around substance use disorders and really the cycle of recovery. And many caregivers who come into care who come into fostering have done so without really direct experience or knowledge of the cycle of substance use disorder. And when I say that, what I mean is this kind of the cycle of what that looks like. It means disordered use, treatment, recovery, relapse, treatment, recovery. And that those of us that have direct experience of this understand that that can take numerous cycles before we really find long-term stability. We also know that recovery requires community supports and family supports. It really requires really strong supports for those families, which are typically insufficient or unavailable to those who are involved in the child welfare system or those who are struggling with addiction. And in fact, our system, I really believe inadvertently, is set up to keep people apart, specifically caregivers and parents it keeps them apart from one another, and inadvertently really prevents key potential community support, those caregivers, kinship and foster caregivers, from parents when they need it most, when they are in addiction. And at Amara, we found that we can work with caregivers through training and ongoing support to ensure that caregivers can be a really positive, respectful, caring, and supportive space for parents whose kids are in foster care, and that we can help caregivers build these positive, supportive relationships that are really strength-based and judgment-free in nature. And that by doing this, by offering these specific trainings that Congresswoman Strickland kind of outlined, the various ways that we can be training staff, caregivers, that we really should be focusing trainings that center relationship building, community building, along with education around specific topics like substance abuse disorders, trauma-informed care, and the way that all of those kind of come together around family dynamics. We're already doing this as an organization at Amara around trauma-informed care and relationship building, but we don't have the work around substance use disorders, and that would be something that would be really meaningful to add. And the Foster Act will allow for additional funding streams to be accessed to provide those types of trainings, which could be incredibly impactful within child welfare. Being able to shift the expectations of foster and kinship parents from being a temporary caregiver into something more of a key community partner who's supporting a parent and their children could be transformative.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. I think it's really important to see too the work that you all are doing on the ground and working with youth and families who, are experiencing the foster care system, but also caregivers and kinship families, mentors, and especially the workforce. And I think Congresswoman Strickland, that's one thing that I really love about this bill is that it also really focuses on training and supports for the workforce, those caseworkers, those social workers that are really helping our families and youth on the ground. But want to open it up to a discussion for all of us. So feel free to, jump in and ask questions and more of a, discussion flow. But maybe we can turn over to you first, Congresswoman Strickland, and just talk a little bit more about the bill and how it's making its way through Congress, and maybe there's ways that we can help support you in your efforts in getting this passed and signed into law.
Great. Well, thank you. And I appreciate the discussion that we've had with Senator Nobles and with Amara. And I want to take a step back here because I think about the world we want to have, the society we want to have. And when I think about the US, I think about us wanting a nation that is safe, that is just, and that is secure. And when you think about those three words, sometimes certain things come to mind, but every single policy that I'm working on is going to fit at least into one of those buckets or two or three of those buckets. And I say this because, as we're talking about foster care, we want children to feel safe. We want families to feel safe. And when I talk about wanting it to be just, we will do this through the lens of equity. We will ensure that we are being very culturally competent about how we're treating folks, families, even the content that we're using, and then secure. I mean, children need two things to do well. They want to feel loved and they want to feel blessed and secure. And if we think about the role of security, it's having your basic needs met. And for so many children, those basic needs aren't being met, sadly, because the basic needs of the parents aren't being met. So when it comes to the Foster Act, as I mentioned earlier, I do have two co-sponsors, Congressman Derek Kilmer, who is my neighbor, and then also we have people from both sides of the aisle. And as much as you hear about Congress being so divided and unable to do things, we have these moments of bipartisanship. And this issue is something that affects all communities, whether you're urban, rural, or suburban. It doesn't discriminate based on your political beliefs or your ideology. It affects every family. And I think that's why we've been able to get 20 co-sponsors in a bipartisan way and doing what we can to move this through. It is now at the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and they will do a markup and write it up. And hopefully there will come a time when we can say that we did in fact pass the Foster Act. But there are moments, and Senator Nobles knows this, where you have topics that just transcend everything. And we have to realize sometimes we have shared humanity. We want to take care of people and we want to help their basic needs get met. And this is where the Foster Act comes in, looking at the opioid crisis, identifying, putting resources, and doing what we can, again, to have a society in a country that is safe, just, and secure.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and it really is so true. We first need to really support these young people and their family, and also the society, making sure that they're safe and secure. So I love that, and I think that's such a great principle in all the work that you're doing. Nicole, I was hoping to, I know you shared a little bit about the work that you all are doing on the ground, but and you mentioned how the Foster Act could really improve services for the workforce and for families and can providers and young people. But could you talk a little bit more how you really think it could look like on the ground, and helping these young people and families?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just so appreciate those pillars of safety, justice, and security. I think that's a really great way to look at all of the different ways in which we are working as a community. We would love to see all those involved in the child welfare system take on the perspective that really centers safety, justice, and security, that recovery is not only possible, but it's a shared goal, and that reunification of families is also the goal of foster care. And if we center these two beliefs, then our interventions, our training, our support for workers, for caregivers, and for parents and families, our specific practices, they can all work towards these goals, and we can really be aligned and find that all of the different services that are on the ground can really complement one another in working towards these shared goals. Within foster care, we can really do this by recruiting and training families who want to help other families find recovery and safely reunify with their children, and who want to learn how to do that, because most of us don't come into foster care knowing how to do that yet. The families we want to recruit, all that they are is stable in their lives. They don't have to be superheroes. They don't have to have all of the knowledge. They just need to have extra capacity, extra love to share, and a willingness to learn and take on new information. And because if we find those families, and I think all of us are those families, we can make sure that we're really recruiting the right families that are able to be that stabilizing force for youth and for their parents. And they're able to, those caregivers can be the person that a parent can vent to when they're having a tough day, when they're stuck in 25 different lines and don't know where to go next, when their car breaks down, whatever may have happened to them in that day, they can be the person that they can turn to and vent with. In daily practice, it looks like inviting a parent to the park to play with their kids and waiting an extra 30 minutes because they missed the bus, and just really focusing on being available to that parent and their kids to bring them together. And we really need to understand that this investment, and this is what Senator Noble said, it's not only one thing, right? And this is not going to solve every single piece, but it's training and ongoing support, being there, picking up the phone, being the person that caregivers can ask for feedback and ideas and how to do things differently the next time. We need to really provide them with ongoing support in building and maintaining these important and safe and really non-judgmental, these secure relationships with parents. And we need these types of supports for foster and kinship caregivers, because it's about both training and ongoing case management.
And I want to jump in for a second here too, because I think one of the things that we are really talking about here, we're talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And we talk about all the basic needs we have, but again, whether it's children in school or parents or those around them, humans want two things. We want to feel safe and we want to feel loved. And that can come in many different forms. But if those two basic emotional needs are met, there is so much that can be overcome when we talk about challenges in this world.
Absolutely. And I think too, especially Senator Noble's, with your lived experience and just being a powerhouse in the Washington State Senate in your freshman term, and working bipartisanly on these issues for young people and families that often slip through the cracks, promoting those pillars is just remarkable, and so exciting to have both of you on this call. But could you talk a little bit too, how you're promoting those pillars and the policy work that you want to do in the Senate, now and beyond, and how to energize, state legislatures in that movement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the best things that I can do as someone that wants to see a change in legislation is to make sure that I am being a champion for the stories of community members, for our youth, for our families who are stepping in to provide that love and security, for our young people, to make sure that I consistently share my story also with my colleagues and highlight the importance of wrapping our arms around our youth and families who are experiencing our foster care system in some way, shape, or form. And the other thing, as a participant and the National Council for School or for State Legislators Opioid Fellows Program, is making sure that as I'm working on solutions to our opioid crisis in the state and working on how we can support and create better outcomes for our youth experiencing foster care, that I am thinking of those things together and thinking of the intersections. That I had a community member ask, like, will you all be talking about the children of incarcerated parents, and just knowing how real it is, all of what has been shared tonight. But in our background as young kids, we also had experience with a parent who was incarcerated, and we still deal with that cycle of trying to deal with substance use and the illness that causes and creates that, and just that constant struggle with a family member. But my experience is so broad, not from just being a youth in care, but serving as a case aide in my work study job, and paying attention to those visits and being gracious, as Nicole mentioned, providing a little extra time, within the confines of what a visit should look like, and returning young people home to their families, to again being able to create legislation and understand the issues. But my job is to tell the stories of community all the time, and to make sure that wherever I am, if the topic is education or if the topic is health and safety, a just economy for all, that I am keeping in mind those intersections, and how we need to, see the full picture, the bigger picture, when we're trying to work hard together and work hard to solve, the many challenges that our community faces. So that's my job, and I'm excited to focus on just so many important topics for our youth who are aging out of care, to helping to provide financial literacy to our youth in care, to our transitional and independent living programs that were instrumental for folks like me to get our first place and learn how to pay our bills and live on our own as college students are focused on career. But there's so many topics that we do need to approach with that trauma-informed lens as we're thinking about our young people and helping them to become more independent and transition as young adults in our society. And I'm just excited to be a part of the work with the Congresswoman and with Amara.
Yes, well, thank you, Senator Nobles. And, I think we're all, committed here to, pushing that forward. And it's so important in making sure that we're really listening to these young people and caseworkers and their families as we continue to, help kind of break down these policy barriers. I guess, and I know we're coming up on time here, so I want to definitely open it up if other panelists have any questions for each other. But I think my one last question for you all, as we continue to work on moving the Foster Act forward, how can we make sure that, passed into law and implemented, that, the education, the training is really serving all, families and backgrounds, and also providing supports to every single type of caregiver and family and young person. And I think, Senator Nobles, you mentioned it, that the child welfare system just touches so much, from housing to healthcare to the justice, the courts. Really, how can we make sure that it's really supporting, all youth and families and caregivers?
Great question. And I think the Congresswoman hit it on the head earlier with the cultural competency. And culture is not just race and ethnicity. Culture is defined very broadly. But the more that everyone that is going to touch and impact the future or the present of our young people, the more that they have the skills, the training, the resources, just someone to tell them they're doing a good job, or someone to provide feedback and help them to be an even better caregiver. Just being aware of the culture in homes and schools and in communities, and the racial and ethnic cultures of our different community members. I think that will be just key to showing up and doing our best job. And none of us will do it perfectly. Nicole said earlier, we're looking for folks who can provide stability, and we're looking for love and support, and it's not perfection. And we want to just provide the very best opportunity for our young people. So just keeping that in mind and trying to be as competent and as skilled and as loving as possible, and to keep our young people safe. I think those are the priorities that we're asking of for our community. And I do have a question that I want to pose back to, I mentioned a community member reached out to me and asked about work that is happening on state and federal levels for our children who are experiencing care and their parents are incarcerated. And so I just would love to know if anyone could speak a little bit more to what that work looks like, either on a state level or federal level, and what our community can expect moving forward.
I can talk a little bit about on the federal side, but definitely want to turn it over to Nicole, especially at the state level.
Yeah, so I don't have really great answers on that, but I do know that there is a lot of work being done around really looking at when parental rights are being terminated and what information goes into that, and particularly thinking about so for those who are incarcerated, understanding that while they're incarcerated, that just being incarcerated does not equate to not participating in working towards getting their children back, and that there really need to be active efforts. So there's a lot of work being done around kind of shifting policy language to make sure that there's active efforts being made to engage those families. And then there's other stuff that isn't directly related, but I think is really closely related around removing. Right now, wages are frequently garnished when kids are in care in an effort to, I can't remember the right words, but to help with parental support. And that is going to just leave people unable to meet their basic needs, to pay their bills, and could lead to further incarceration or leave people incarcerated because they don't have the funds that they need. So there's a lot of different things that are happening at the state level.
You know, and I would say at the federal level, it's not necessarily looking at people who are incarcerated and have children, but looking at some of the bigger structural things that end up separating families that land them in a place where they're incarcerated. And so, you know, for me, I have been very adamant about legalizing cannabis because we know those offenses sometimes pile up. People can't pay their bills, they can't pay bail, and it just turns into this cycle, and someone ends up behind bars, and then it separates the family, and it just turns into a downward spiral. I also think that there are ways that we think about the foster care system, and to be honest with you, I think culturally, we sometimes shame people. And we think that, okay, if someone makes one mistake, the damage is irreparable and they lost their right to be a parent. And I think, you know, you just mentioned earlier that, you know, some of the systems that we have that find people end up putting them in a very, very hard position. So for me, it's really looking at some of the structural things that end up separating families as much as what we're doing to reunite families that have been separated because someone's being incarcerated. I tend to be a root causes kind of person. And so if we can try to stem the flow of people who are being, I'm going to say, over incarcerated for the wrong reasons, and we cannot deny that there is a racial bias in that, then we can start to reunite. You know, we can avoid putting families in that very horrible situation.
Yes, absolutely. And just several years ago, there was a large federal law passed called the Family First Prevention Services Act, which Congresswoman is just saying exactly focus on reunifying and keeping families together and allowing federal dollars to actually, you know, work in that way. So states are working hard on the ground to, you know, implement those laws. So exactly, Congresswoman. And I'm so glad that you mention that and share that, and thank you, Nicole, for sharing the work that's happening on the ground. And I know we're getting close to time. I know we could just keep talking about this issue for hours, but I just want to really thank Congresswoman. Thank you so much for your work and leading this effort. We're all very committed to helping you pave the way, and thank you for thinking of these young people and their families as, you know, oftentimes they do slip through the cracks, and making sure they're at the forefront as Congress continues to pass laws and create change. So thank you very much for your leadership, and Senator Nobles, thank you for your leadership. And I know we're right alongside you as you continue to pave the way in Washington alongside Nicole and Amara. It's just incredible to be among three giants here paving the way for children and families. And I hope we all, as Congresswoman mentioned, the three pillars of safety, justice, and security, and all the work that we do. So really thank you for your time, your commitment, and I hope we can continue to keep this discussion moving forward. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and just really thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.